In this session today, we will look at the key concepts and terminology of the CAT4 abilities test. Now, this is central to your understanding of what all the numbers mean, of which there are many, and essential to help you to support your students and your colleagues. We will examine the reports available to you and how to utilise these to understand your data with a case study as an example. Next, we will delve deeper into the data and provide some practical suggestions for analysis and use. Moving on to parental engagement, which we know is very important in the UAE, how you can communicate the CAT4 data to parents using the parental report, its contents and what it means. Finally, what to do next following this webinar and the further support that is available to you. The key concepts and terminology. Now, this is critical to accessing and utilising CAT4 and essential for effectively making sure that you have a strong grasp of the key concepts and terminology. This is also essential for you to feel confident in effectively delivering information about your CAT4 data to staff, students and to parents. Now, the CAT4, for those that perhaps are less familiar, comprises 4 batteries of tests that assess the main types of mental processing that play a substantial role in human thought. Now, this is validated every year based on an analysis from around 250,000 students. The test has a reliability coefficient of 0.96, meaning that you can be sure that the data that you get from the CAT4 is both accurate and trustworthy. Together, the 4 batteries that make up CAT4 provide us with a comprehensive understanding of the core abilities related to learning. The set of 4 scores obtained from the assessment provides a profile of a student's abilities, as well as providing an overall summary score of their reasoning abilities across the 4 areas. The 4 areas are verbal, non-verbal, spatial, and quantitative. Verbal and quantitative are often easily understood as reasoning with words and reasoning with numbers. And they are the most influenced by classroom teaching and a school student experience. So in English lessons and in mathematics, science lessons, in working with numbers. Spatial reasoning is important for working in many spatial disciplines and careers. For example, engineering, physical sciences, mathematics and architecture. The non-verbal battery correlates most highly with the overall mean score, as other cognitive areas are also utilised in this battery. Some more key vocabulary and what the numbers mean. So the standard age score, or SAS or SAS as it may be referred, is the most important piece of information derived from any standardised test. The SAS is based on the student's raw score, simply placed, that's simply the number of marks gained, which has been adjusted for age and placed on a scale that makes a comparison with a nationally representative sample of students. And when we say adjusted for age, we mean age in months. The SAS is the fairest way for you to compare the performance of different students over time across groups or between individuals. The average score is 100. We say that when we use our standardisation sample, the national sample, 100 is the expected level. The scale runs from 59 to 141. Now, if you are using CAT4 level X in your school, the scale runs from 69 to 131. And this is because of the length of the test. The probability of any student obtaining a score below the scale of 59 or 69 is negligible and also above, hence the scale being cut off at those points. The average range is 89 to 111. The below average range, 88 and below. The above, 112 and above, with 125 considered very high. The STAY9 provides a broad overview of performance and is a scaled score from 1 to 9, with 1 being the lowest and 9 the highest. STAY9's 4, 5 and 6 show average developed ability for the CAT4 assessment. You will also see reference to the national percentile rank, sometimes referred to as percentile rank, PR, as it's seen here, or NPR. Now, CAT4 is standardised against the UK diverse school population, Now, this has proven to be reliable for international schools. However, many international schools have asked for an international standardization of these assessments. So we have analysed CAT4 scores from all of our international school customers to provide useful benchmarking. The full document is available on our website using the link provided on this slide, which will be shared with you after the session. It's worth noting that there is slightly higher mean scores in international schools, but also noting that the verbal mean across all of the levels is slightly lower, which we would expect in international schools. In addition to the numerical data, of which there is plenty, CAT4 will also highlight if a student has a particular bias toward verbal reasoning, spatial reasoning, or if they have an even profile. The most common profile for students to receive is the no bias profile, since abilities in verbal spatial are correlated to a high degree. Students also tend to move to a less extreme profile over time. So data from students who take CAT4 twice, 2 years apart, suggests that students are unlikely to retain the same profile over this time unless it is the no bias profile. This is consistent with other tests of cognitive ability, not just CAT4, and is part of the reason why contrasting results across the 4 batteries and asking questions about your understanding of your students is so important, because differences are sometimes unexpected. To explain this a little further, verbal abilities can be thought of as our inner voice, and spatial abilities can be thought of as our inner eye, our ability to conceptualize and imagine. They are 2 distinct abilities that do not rely on one another. Non-verbal and quantitative abilities, however, they utilize our verbal and spatial abilities to some extent, the degree to which depends on the individual student. Non-verbal and quantitative abilities can therefore be thought of hybrid. When we talk about verbal spatial profiles, we're talking about the balance or imbalance of verbal and spatial abilities. It's extremely important that you don't look at a learner's verbal spatial profile as a reason to restrict the teaching approaches or the learning activities accessible for a student. These are very different to the outdated notion of learning styles such as VAK. What the verbal spatial profile tells you is where a student's strengths and weaknesses lie in terms of their cognitive abilities. That student will be far more likely to reach their potential if their strengths can be utilised and their weaknesses developed. So a full range of teaching approaches and learning activities should still be used with all students, but using your CAT4 data, you will be able to understand which students may need more support and which need challenge in certain areas, and how you can facilitate this in your classroom. A high even profile refers to students who have above average scores in both verbal and spatial reasoning. These students are usually self-motivated and independent learners. These students will likely benefit from being challenged. A low even profile will show up for students with below average scores in both verbal and spatial reasoning. These students will often have difficulty learning abstract concepts, and transferring knowledge and skills learned in one context to another may be difficult and may need prompting. Stronger spatial scores result in a spatial bias profile, and this is commonly seen in students still acquiring the English language, so particularly pertinent for international schools using CAT4. An extreme verbal or spatial profile does not mean that a student doesn't need support. For example, a student with an extreme verbal profile may present as highly able in all areas, but in fact may struggle with visualization and conceptualization, skills required in practical subjects such as science, computing, and design technology. Students with a spatial bias may find language content heavy subjects such as humanities and obviously English challenging. As I already said, this is common in English language learners or EAL students. Another element that is worth considering beyond the mean SAS and verbal spatial profile is the relationship between the scores between the 4 batteries, in particular the verbal and non-verbal scores. The verbal battery is the most utilised in traditional examinations. A weakness here can hinder access to the wider curriculum beyond English. The verbal deficit or surfeit is calculated by subtracting the non-verbal score from the verbal score. We tend to say that a difference of plus or minus 10 or more should be highlighted and extremes investigated further. Reports and understanding your data. So in this section, we will look at the range of reports available to you and how each will help you, your colleagues and your parents understand the data. There are a wide range of reports available to you, as you can see on the screen, providing different levels of data analysis and intended for different purposes. The group report for teachers provides a whole cohort, class or tutor group level analysis with individual data included. The summary report for senior leaders includes key group analysis such as boys and girls, those identified as having a special educational need, and in the UAE, Custom 2 or Emirati nationals. The Excel report can be generated at individual whole cohort, Excel or tutor group level, or class or tutor group level, and provides additional information, very important additional information, such as the number of questions attempted in each battery. The individual report for teachers drills down into individual level findings, providing specific implications for teaching and learning based on an individual's CAT4 profile. Combination reports are available to compare CAT4 indicated ability with actual attainment in the progress test in English and maths and the new group reading test or NGRT. Also available are individual reports for parents and for students. Now, these have been specifically designed to communicate information about the CAT4 test and the results and what these mean to parents and students in a way that is easy to understand. So specifically avoiding teacher speak. This is from the group report for teachers and also would be included in the summary report for senior leaders. And the group report for teachers provides a top level overview of the distribution of student scores across each of the 4 batteries. The pink curve that we can see here is the standardization. We would expect in a typical school to see the majority of the scores within the average band, with some scores below average and some scores above average. This bar chart allows you to compare your group scores against the standardization. In this example, the quantitative, which is shown in purple, non-verbal and spatial scores have a slight right skew. The scores tend towards the higher end. We can see this here. The verbal scores are slightly skewed to the left. So the verbal being the blue bar, and we can see we have a higher percentage or a higher bar chart in these below average areas. In a class profile such as this with a score and a distribution, it would be worth asking and considering, could this be due to a high percentage of EAL students in this cohort? The quantitative and non-verbal scores here tend toward the right. So this group of students generally have an average or to above average developed ability in these areas. Also in the group report for teachers and also in the summary report for senior leaders, the student profile scatter plot is provided. And this is a useful visual to see trends in the data and whether students have a verbal or spatial bias or an even profile. A list of students falling into each category is provided within the reports. And this is color coded, and we can see the increased spatial bias being in the purple. We have 1 student here, and the dots are color coded by gender, pink being girls and blue being boys. And we can also see that we've got 1 student up here and another there with an extreme verbal profile. In the summary report for senior leaders, the data is also presented per battery for the demographic groups that are defined within your student level data that's held in TestWise. It's really worth ensuring that your TestWise student register is both up to date and as complete as possible should you want to take advantage of this level of reporting. This will allow you to analyse groups such as gender, but also those with English as an additional language. The data is also presented in easy to read tables, providing an overview of the cohort average scores across each battery, and the percentage of students falling into each of the SAS bands is provided. This is all drawn from the TestWise student records. So if this data is not up to date, is inconsistent or incorrect, this will be reflected in the reports that you are able to generate. This is an example where data for key groups has not been entered or has been entered inconsistently in TestWise. This is English as an additional language, EAL students, and we can see that we've got 100%, only perhaps one student has been entered as yes, with the rest being unknown. The summary report for senior leaders includes graphical and tabulated data for custom groups. Now, this is particularly pertinent in the UAE, where custom 2 field is used for Emirati students. The reports will be generated per battery for that custom group, which is required for reporting. Both the group report for teachers and the summary report for senior leaders provide indicators of future examination performance, such as Key Stage 2 SAT results for UK curriculum schools, GCSE, A-level and IB can be generated, and this has to be selected when the report is created. Schools use a variety of ways to assess attainment as students move through the school phases, including our progress test series. For schools in England and Wales, Key Stage 2 SATs usually provide a benchmark for the end of year 6 and the start of secondary education. Cat 4 A, B and C provide Key Stage 2 indicated performance. Level D provides retrospective Key Stage 2 indicators, which are shown here on the screen. 9 to 1 GCSE indicators are available from level D upwards. That is our test appropriate to year 7 in international British curriculum schools. These are derived from an analysis of Cat 4 scores and 2019 GCSE results from a nationally representative sample of around 91,000 students. As you can see from this example level D group report, each student has 2 GCSE indicators for each subject, shown in decimal format, based on that prior performance in each subject of students with the same standard age score, SAS. The first value is based on average performance of members of the sample group with the same underlying ability scores. This is the most likely GCSE grade. The second figure is an if challenged indicator based on the outcomes of the top 25% of students with the same Cat 4 score. Indicators can be a useful tool to support schools in targeted support, as well as collaborating with students to set targets and goals. Now, delving a little bit deeper into the data and looking beyond the mean SAS, having looked at the group report and summary report for senior leaders, we're going to delve a little deeper into the data utilising case studies, the Excel report, the individual report for teachers, and finishing with combination reports that are available with Cat 4 and our attainment tests already mentioned, the progress test series and the NGRT. Starting, we're going to look at a case study, and this student is known to many teachers. Sarah is quiet, lacks confidence, and often gets quite frustrated when she has to do independent writing tasks. Sarah doesn't ask questions in class, never puts her hand up or to contribute her thoughts and answers, and many teachers say she just needs more confidence in her ability. And as a former teacher, I think we can all think of a similar student that we have had in our classrooms. The SAS for each of the 4 batteries are given separately in the group report for teachers and in the individual report. They are averaged to give the mean score, so the mean SAS. The mean SAS value is useful in terms of providing an initial overview. However, in terms of understanding an individual's ability, it is only the first step, and it is important to look beyond that mean. So let's look at Sarah in closer detail. Sarah has a mean SAS value of 110, comfortably above average, but the mean score masks Sarah's high quantitative ability and low verbal reasoning score. She has a verbal deficit of -31. If teachers are only looking at her mean, they may assume that Sarah is fine, and they may not understand why she is inconsistent in her classwork. It also explains why some teachers experience Sarah being more engaged in some of her classes and finishing first. It's most likely that in lessons such as maths, Sarah is able to engage enough to excel, but over time, the likelihood is that her low verbal ability would impact her use of vocabulary in all subjects, including maths, because we need to consider problem-solving questions where a verbal ability is required. So we need to delve more deeply into the profile of ability that is made up of the student's scores, shown separately in each of the cognitive areas. By doing this, we can start to take direction from the data to help us establish the best strategy to take for a cohort or for an individual student such as Sarah. What does the data then tell us? So let's look at 2 student profiles to see what the data can tell us about the individual. These tables are taken from the individual report for teachers. So student 1, this student's scores are all in the below average range. We can see here the mean SAS, and this is the individual SAS scores for each of the individual batteries, and the mean at the bottom. We can also see the number of questions attempted in this individual report. This student demonstrates a low cognitive ability and will need to be investigated further. Consider what you already know about the student to make an appropriate decision about the follow-up. You may need to refer them to your learning support team for further screening. And it is likely that the student will need a lot of support in lessons to ensure that they can access the curriculum and remain engaged and make good progress. In contrast to student 1, student 2 are all in the above average range. We can see the individual SAS scores, SAS scores, quantitative, just the very high average range. This student demonstrates a high cognitive ability and will benefit from stretch and challenge in the classroom. We would expect this student to be attaining at a high level across all subjects. If they are not, consider the reasons why, such as, are they being challenged enough or are they bored? How are you keeping them motivated and engaged in the classroom? Are there any attitudinal issues that need to be addressed? There are always surprises, as there are always in schools, surprises. And now, whilst we've looked at why it is important to look at the 4 batteries more closely, in order to better understand your students and identify their hidden strengths and weaknesses, you may students that have low battery scores that you can't quite explain with the existing knowledge that you have about them. There are a few more steps that we recommend for these students. To start with, check how many questions they've attempted. This is available in the reports, individual report for teachers, or in the Excel report. If the student has completed a very low number across all 4 batteries, is this because they did not try their best in the test, in which case speaking to the student may be helpful, or using our pupil attitudes to self and school survey, PASS, may help you identify the underlying issue. If they did attempt most or all of the questions, or the number of questions attempted dipped significantly in one area, then the low score is likely to reflect a real weakness. We can see this here in the quantitative battery for this student, where only 16 of 36 questions were attempted. So is this a processing difficulty? Finally, it may be that the student has individual learning needs. If these have been previously context and should help you identify their strengths as well as their weaknesses. If learning needs have not been previously identified, these students would benefit from further investigation. The various battery scores will be able to give you an indication of where to start in Cat 4. It is recommended that students with a Stanine score of 3 or below on the verbal battery should be administered a reading test such as the NGRT, New Group Reading Test, as a follow-up to identify, where further support is required. With the NGRT, we have a reading diagnostic pathway that can help you investigate students further. Students with comparably low quantitative score may benefit from a dyscalculia screener, as shown here in this example. Looking at hidden strengths and weaknesses, I think I've, the Excel report and a practical suggestion. So in your Excel report, using a simple color coding system to highlight scores for quick and easy interpretation. Now, if you're unsure how to use conditional formatting, we have a linked video guide in how to apply this. Looking at hidden strengths and weaknesses. We can see here that we've got 4 students who are with a mean SAS, all within the average range. So similar to our case study of Sarah, all of the students have a mean SAS within the average range. And so it could be easily assumed that these students are able to access the curriculum with little to no support, and they will perform at an average or above across all of their subjects if we don't look beyond that mean. However, if we look at their individual battery scores, this is not the case, or it may not be the case. If we just rely on the mean score, the potential to achieve more, or conversely, the need for support could be missed. The colour coding makes it very easy to pick out key pieces of information. So if we look here, the colour coding makes it very easy to quickly identify, and we can immediately see that Jason and Jack have a quantitative weakness in comparison to their other areas. Jack also has a verbal weakness, as does Tariq. Thomas has a low score in the spatial battery. We can also see that these students have strengths in specific areas, which if we just looked at the mean, we may miss. Jason and Jack have above average scores in the spatial battery, and Tariq in both non-verbal and spatial. Another practical suggestion for the Excel report is adding a notes column to the end of the Excel file so that you can record your interpretations of the data as you explore each student's individual profile and their battery scores, revealing any hidden strengths and weaknesses. It may also be useful here to record any areas, any batteries where there was a low number of questions attempted. Practical suggestion number 3. You can add a column to calculate the verbal deficit. This would be a formula to subtract the non-verbal from the verbal. So the formula to calculate this for Ellie in this example would be equals D2 minus F2. We can see that here, D2 minus F2, and it results in a verbal deficit for Ellie of minus 16. And a further practical suggestion from the Excel report, and as I've mentioned a number of times already, the number of questions attempted is an important piece of data that is provided in the Excel report and in the individual reports. The verbal and non-verbal batteries each have 48 questions, and the quantitative and spatial each have 36. Highlighting those that have attempted less than 75% of the questions can be insightful. As the CAT4 is a timed test, if a student takes a long time to answer each question, their score will be impacted. A low number of questions attempted in all batteries can be an indicator of attitudinal issues or additional learning need. A low number in an individual battery may indicate a weakness in that specific cognitive area. The raw score in the Excel report tells you, out of the questions attempted, the number of correct responses. In this example, we can see that the first student attempted 27 out of 48 questions in the verbal battery, but only 6 were correct. It is important to remember that 2 children can have the same raw score, but a different standard age score, as the score is adjusted for their age. Now, looking at the individual report, once you've identified students whose data you would like to look at in more detail from the group report, from the senior leader report, or from the Excel report by using the colour coding and conditional formatting, then the individual student report for teachers will provide similar data as found in the group report, but for the individual student. The individual report for teachers can be generated as single PDF files for each student or with multiple reports within a single file. Individual reports are available for teachers, students and parents, with the report for students and parents being adapted in terms of content and language used. As I've already explained, it removes the teacher speak. Now, for the individual report for teachers, it is a good idea to run this report for students who have come to your attention. From the group report or from the Excel report, they may have a below average score, an extreme profile, a large verbal deficit or surfeit, or a significant weakness in one of the batteries. Or perhaps the student is known to you for another reason, from maybe being mentioned repeatedly within the staff room or from their pastoral leaders or their individual subject teachers. The report provides a full analysis of the individual student scores. This will include their number of attempted questions in each battery, their SAS, STAY9, NPR, so National Percentile Rank, their group rank, where they sit within the group, the cohort, and an indicator for future test performance, either GCSE or Key Stage 2 SAT. The individual report for teachers provides personalised suggestions for teaching and learning based on the individual profile. This will include practical suggestions for how students can be supported with teaching and learning strategies, making the most of their strengths and developing their weaknesses. The individual report for teachers provides a breakdown of scores in table format, and this includes the confidence bands for the score. We can see that here. This student has a mean within the average range, but a very low quantitative score and attempts a relatively low number of questions in all 4 batteries. Well, particularly in quantitative and in spatial. Using the colour coding in the Excel report, this would have highlighted this student's low quantitative score, prompting me to look further at their profile and generate the individual report. The individual report for teachers, as I've said, includes personalised implications for teaching and learning, helping your teachers to understand how they can translate this information into classroom-based next steps. These are suggested based upon the student's score profile. I want to focus now on what Cat 4 can tell us about EAL students, particularly pertinent for international schools and for the UAE. We would expect to see a spatial bias as verbal reasoning skills in reasoning abilities in English will be suppressed if they are still acquiring the English language. It is typical that these students have a significant verbal deficit. Traditional assessments such as GCSEs, A-levels, Key Stage 2 SATs rely heavily on verbal ability, whereas Cat 4 provides a robust measure of their abilities in the other batteries quite independently of their verbal skills. The verbal battery is the only one that is language dependent. This can be particularly helpful in understanding a student's future potential, where their attainment in the classroom may be currently hindered by a language barrier. In the case of able and talented EAL students, where scores are high across all batteries, there may be a relative weakness in the verbal battery in comparison to the others, and it should still be considered that this comparative weakness could impede these students in reaching their full potential, particularly in language content heavy subjects. So giving an example, for students still acquiring the English language, you would anticipate that the individual test data will demonstrate both a high verbal deficit as well as an extreme spatial bias, as seen in these profiles. It would be expected that the verbal deficit would decrease and the spatial bias would balance over time, as their verbal abilities should improve as they become more proficient in the English language. Retesting over time, such as 2 years later, would most likely see an increase in their verbal score as their language acquisition develops and language barriers reduce. The profiles shown here are, in fact, from the same student tested in year 7, shown on the left, and then in year 9, shown on the right. At the time of test 1, this student had a very limited understanding of the English language. This greatly improved over the 2-year period, and this had a positive impact in his confidence, His performance in numerical subjects such as maths and science greatly improved. And as we said earlier, it is the verbal and quantitative batteries that are most influenced by schooling classroom experiences. And that is where we see the greatest improvement following interventions here. We can gain valuable insight into their potential where it would be difficult to do so with other methods. This is exemplified in this profile because this shows potentially a very able child who could achieve very highly if their language needs are addressed. This is demonstrated in their above average scores highlighted in the two tests. So, how does this all come together to facilitate real impact on the classroom experiences of your learners? Looking at the case study of Tariq, we mentioned him earlier when we were looking at hidden strengths and weaknesses. Tariq appears to be quite fluent in the English language, but is not a native English speaker, and this is not the language used at home. Tariq's strengths lie in his visual cognitive ability, as he has had to develop this to compensate for his difficulties with the English language. Although he is now working at standards consistent with students in the average range in his English lessons, he's got a score of 88 in his verbal battery. Tariq works better when information is presented visually. Calculating the difference between Tariq's verbal and non-verbal skills confirms a significant verbal deficit of -27. This is common in students who are still acquiring the English language. Tariq may not be identified as an EAL student requiring interventions and individual support, but his weakness in this area may well restrict his ability to reach his full potential, particularly in language content heavy subjects such as humanities. In our traditional examination system, the average reading age of GCSE papers is 15 years and 6 months. An English language learner or EAL students like Tariq will need support from class teachers in the use of what we call content obligatory language and constructing extended written responses, providing essential key terminology and definition lists at the start of new topics, and asking students to highlight words that they don't know the meaning of in text, and working through these with them are examples of classroom practices that would assist students like Tariq. Moving on to combination reports, these are available, as you can see, to compare indicated ability assessed by CAT4 with actual attainment as measured in the progress test series and the NGRT. So in the CAT4 and the PTM progress test in maths, the CAT4 ability score used for comparison is quantitative reasoning, and that's then compared with the maths attainment. PTE, verbal reasoning, NGRT, it's compared with verbal reasoning. We also provide a combination report to include PTM and PTE, PTM and NGRT. Within the combination report, so data from the CAT4 ability test is compared with the attainment data from the progress test series, English and Maths, or the New Group Reading Test, NGRT, and it is presented in the combination report both graphically and numerically. This is an example from the CAT4 and PTE combination report, where the verbal battery from the CAT4 test is combined with the attainment score in the PTE. For the progress test in maths, the quantitative battery is used, and for the NGRT, again, it is the verbal battery that is compared. We can see here the verbal battery in blue and the PTE attainment score in yellow. Within the combination report, a table is provided to compare the cohort attainment with the standardization sample. This provides a very quick and easy way to measure the attainment of a group of students and whether it is in line with their indicated ability from the CAT4. Individual student data is included within the report, making it easy to identify those whose attainment is below their indicated ability. In this example here, we've got 41 students with lower than expected maths attainment in comparison to their quantitative indicated ability from the CAT4, and 16 with much lower than expected maths attainment. A starting point would be to immediately identify those students using the list provided in the combination report. Parental engagement. This is particularly important in the UAE, and we are aware parents are very interested in the CAT4 and any testing that takes place. It's important to communicate effectively with the school community, and particularly parents who will be anxious about any assessments that their children are required to undertake. And we know that they ask a lot of questions. In this section, we will explore how the reports provided by CAT4 can assist you with parental engagement. So the individual report for parents offers a parent-friendly overview of their child's scores, enabling the parent to understand how they can best support their child's learning needs. The report provides an overview of the CAT4 and what it is, what it entails, the level their child has taken, and provides example questions from each battery. You can see here verbal, reasoning and quantitative, and also non-verbal and spatial. The non-verbal and the spatial battery are often the most difficult to explain to a parent in terms of the questions that are included. So providing these examples is particularly useful. The included summary is intended to help the parent to understand, the child's individual battery scores that you've seen in the individual report for teachers are not provided as numbers. Instead, this is provided as a simplified bar chart with the average range highlighted in yellow. Indicators of future attainment can be included where applicable, such as IGCSE, IB and A-level. And we will look further at these indicators in a moment. The included summary is intended to help the parent to understand their child's cognitive abilities, their strengths and their weaknesses, and how they can better support them in their learning at home. As I've just said, the CAT4 scores are not provided numerically. So this student has scored above average in every battery. And this is how it is represented for parents, a simplified bar chart. The area in yellow in the bar chart identifies the standard age score average range of 89 to 111. This is stated within the report to help parental understanding. Now, this is included at in the bottom right-hand corner of the page where the bar chart is included. What this tells us about this individual student is that this student is highly able across all 4 reasoning skills, but there is a relative weakness in the verbal battery when we compare that to quantitative, non-verbal and spatial. The parent report also includes a summary with statements about the student's strengths and weaknesses as indicated by their CAT4 profile. Suggestions for supporting the student at home are also provided. So for example, here, D, she's got a high spatial ability, and it informs the parents that she may appear to get the big picture quickly, and her good verbal skills should help in this. She needs to be able to explain how she's arrived at that bigger picture, and that she should be encouraged to read widely outside of school from a different range of books, and thinking about activities that would outside of school that would build on her abilities. As I mentioned, the indicators provide the statistical probabilities of achieving different grades in different subjects. These are provided in the group report for teachers, in the senior leader report, and the individual report for teachers as well. In the parental report, this is again simplified to help parental understanding. We refer to the grades as indicators rather than predicted grades, and this is important as the CAT4 Abilities Test standard age score provides an indication, not a prediction, of future attainment. But cognitive abilities are not fixed and are greatly influenced by teaching and school experience. The scores are indicative of the pupil performance at that moment in time and do not consider attitudinal factors, the impact of teachers or interventions, or significant disruptions to education, as we've recently experienced. You can see the most likely grades in the first column and the if challenge grades in the second column. Most likely is based on the average grade attained by students with the same CAT4 score in the last GCSE sample year, which is currently 2019. The if challenged considers the top 25% of students with the same CAT4 score and the grade that they actually attained. The bar chart in the last column represents the statistical probabilities in a visual format. This is an example of indicators at GCSE level using the letter grades A star to G, and the equivalent stay9 is also shown. In the parent report, indicators of future attainment are also provided in the more simplified chart as we've just seen. For Key Stage 2, for CAT levels C and below, indicators for Key Stage 2 can be generated. For GCSE, CAT level D and above, and CAT level D can also provide retrospective Key Stage 2 indicators. Numerical for the stay9 grades for GCSE is also available. For AS level, and A and AS level indicators are available from CAT 4 levels D and above. Like GCSEs, you can see that the most likely grades in the first column and the if challenge grades in the next column. The bar chart in the last column represents the statistical probabilities in a visual format of the grade achieved. So next steps and what further support is available to you from GL following this webinar. So the various reports contain a wealth of information, lots of data, and the process by which you begin to extract the most relevant data to your school and students can be tailored, but the following steps are a good starting point. Run the group report and Excel reports to quickly identify high and low scores using the conditional formatting to colour code those below average, average and above average ranges. Identify low ability students with low scores across 3 batteries. Identify high ability students with high scores across 3 batteries. Identify the students with extreme verbal and spatial profiles. Identify students with a verbal deficit or a verbal surfeit. The significance of this will be dependent upon your setting in terms of what you would consider extreme. We looked at Tariq earlier with a -27 verbal deficit, yet he was in the high average range, high below average range at 88 in terms of his verbal score. Identify students with a quantitative weakness based on their quantitative scores, and check the number of questions attempted for each battery if there is any data that is particularly standing out to you. Run the individual reports for teachers for any student that has been highlighted and or has been raised as a student of interest by teaching or pastoral teams. This guide is to give you just an indication of some steps that you may take after this webinar and a starting point. Further support that we provide and training. We have a range of training options available to you, and these are mostly self-guided and can be completed in your own time. Stages 1 and 2 for teachers, so we have teachers, CAT 4 teachers training, stage 1 and 2. Are free to access, and stage 3 fees can be accessed on our website, and this is linked within this slide in the presentation. In addition to training, there are a number of support guides and case studies that I highly recommend looking at during the assessment journey. You can find these linked here with the teacher guidance, quick CAT 4 data guide, and the CAT 4 and strategies for learning documents that provides key strategies, recommended strategies based on research, educational research for students with different learning bias profiles. Now, what we're going to do now, I'm going to look at some questions that we have received. So firstly, how do I access the reports? So how do you access the reports? Reports are generated and stored in our TestWise system. So if you have a TestWise account, you can generate and access the reports easily there. If you haven't been given a TestWise account by your TestWise administrator or data manager, you can ask your data manager or TestWise administrator for the specific reports that you want. I can very quickly show you TestWise. I'm just going to very quickly log in to our, this is our assessment insights TestWise. This is a testing environment, not actual pupil data for anybody who was maybe slightly concerned. So this is our TestWise environment, and you may see different options, icons available to you depending on how your user account has been set up. But everybody has access to sittings, students, and reports. Reports are here, and they can be generated by academic year. You can access previous academic years. The tests taken during that academic year are shown here. We've got create report.
Sorry, Vicky, it looks like we're still looking at the presentation. I think it's on share screen versus share.
New share.
Yeah.
I'll start that again. Thank you, Anne.
Great.
Can everybody see that one now, Anne? Can you see TestWise?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay,
yep,
excellent.
You.
Thank you. So going back to this, when you sign into TestWise, if you do have a TestWise account, you may see different icons depending on your access level. You should see sitting, students, and reports. So if we access reports, it will default into the current academic year, and we can see the test taken in the current academic year. Now, this is our test environment. This isn't a real school account that I am showing you now for data protection purposes. And I can see here to create a report. I can select Cat 4 Level D, and then it will show me the reports that are available for generation. And I would click on Group Report for Teachers, and then it would take you through the process of selecting the students that you want to include within that report. The Excel report is also there, and if it is available within your account, the summary report for senior leaders, if you have access to the TestWise to generate your own reports. Individual report for students, individual report for parents, and individual report for teachers can also be generated there as well. Okay. Moving on to further questions. How long does it take to administer Cat 4? Just to check, Anne, can you now see the new tab within my browser?
Yeah, that's right. We can see the,
cool.
the testing times.
Excellent. Okay, so how long does it take to administer Cat 4, and would you advise that it's delivered in one session? Okay, so we can see here the different times that it takes. So this is Cat 4 levels A to G. There's 3 parts to the Cat 4 test. The first one, 30 minutes, but also settling time, getting them set up. So my personal experience is 45 minutes for each section, each part of the Cat 4, for getting them set up and settled. And also what I would recommend is ensuring that they are provided with a piece of paper and a pencil, whether that be for the quantitative, the number analogies and the number reasoning, but also some students find that useful for spatial and also for verbal actually. But recommended in one sitting, no. If possible, dividing it into 3 sittings of 45 minutes each. Now I'm just going to scroll down, because for any schools who administer levels X or pre-A, those times are shortened for such younger students. But again, it would be advised to separate that into 2 sittings for each of the sections. So moving on to other questions. Do you recommend administering Cat 4 remotely if any children are learning from home? No, the big answer is no. So schools who would if it became necessary again due to home learning to consider administering Cat 4 from home, but it really does need to take place in school and wherever possible to ensure that the test environment is suitable, that the test conditions are adhered to, and that the students' responses are their own. So really, we strongly advise against that. And another question, what would be considered a significant verbal deficit or surfeit? So I'm just going to stop my share there, and I'm going to go back to this, just go through, let me just find where we talk about a verbal deficit or surfeit. So the verbal deficit or surfeit is the verbal SAS, SAS, minus the non-verbal, and that will give you a positive or negative result depending on the scores. As I said, we tend to say a plus or minus 10 should be highlighted, adding the column within the Excel report and adding in the formulae to actually calculate the verbal deficit or surfeit, and then using conditional formatting to highlight any value of minus 10 and below, or 10 and above. But what is considered extreme, and having worked in international schools previously, it's very dependent on the profile of your intake and their English language ability. So I've seen a student with a verbal deficit of minus 28 who is fully conversant in the English language. That was highlighted, but that doesn't necessarily automatically indicate that that student needs immediate intervention. It's just the fact is that their non-verbal score was so extremely high, a very high score, and her verbal battery score was relatively, comparatively much lower. So it has to be taken into context as to what is considered extreme. And we use the case study of Tariq with a verbal deficit of minus 27. Now that showed a significant weakness in verbal reasoning, and his score was in the below average range by 1 SAS point. Fully conversant, but doesn't speak English language at home. Would he need one-to-one intervention in terms of the English language? Probably not, but it's important that classroom teachers are aware that he has that verbal weakness so that they can put in classroom interventions, such as highlighting key terminology, extending his vocabulary, and providing definitions of obligatory language within that subject area. I've seen in my previous school a verbal deficit of minus 59. You will know, I think, in the context of your school when it is particularly extreme, and the language ability of that student, and how important it is to ensure that those correct level of interventions, whether that is classroom based or English language individual or group support, is put in place. So moving on. Is there evidence to suggest that CAT 4 scores may have been affected by COVID disruption? Okay, very good question. We reviewed the CAT 4 data from autumn 2020 and the autumn 2020 test window. So that's when CAT 4 is mainly undertaken in the autumn term. Now we compared that test data from autumn 2020 with the previous test window of autumn 2019, and there was no indication at that time that CAT 4 results had been impacted. There was no significant change in the standard age scores across any of the batteries. Now, we are currently analysing the results from the most recent testing window, so that would be autumn 2021, and we're going to do the comparison again with autumn 2019 to see if there's been the extended disruption has impacted the CAT 4 results, because as we have said, cognitive abilities are not fixed and they are impacted by classroom and school experience. To a certain extent, they may be innate, but they are influenced by excellent classroom practice and teaching and school experiences. Next question. So the 9-to-1 GCSE indicators have changed and are now in decimal form. What does this mean? Okay, we all know that a student can't get a 5.5. They can't get a GCSE grade of 5.5. We all know that. We're teachers. So now what that means is it gives an indication of the security and the probability of that child gaining the grade with the decimal point. So our indicators are derived from a statistical analysis of the relationship between assessment scores and national test results from our national sample, our last GCSE examination year being 2019. So they're taken from 2019. We update them as regularly as we can. Unfortunately, the last available update was 2019. Now, these decimal points, as we refer to them, are actually just showing finer grades to 1 decimal point. So with grades ranging from 0.1 to 0.9. So if a student's got a grade, it's showing us a likely grade of 5.1, this would be the lower end of the grade. So yes, their most likely grade is a grade 5, but they are at the lower end of the grade 5, which means that they have a risk of slipping into a grade 4. A grade of 5.2 indicates that it's likely, but again, at the lower end. Whereas if you've got a grade of, say, 6.8, that shows that the student is very likely to secure the grade 6. They're at the higher end of the grade 6, and they may possibly reach into the grade 7. So it's not a decimal point GCSE grade. It's just a finer scale to demonstrate the likelihood, the probability of the student attaining that grade and their security within that grade boundary. And that was all the questions that we had submitted. Anne, have you got any others that you can share that have come in?
We don't at the moment, but we do always respond to the questions following the webinar. So if you do have any further questions, feel free to email them in, and we'll respond when we send the slides out.
Okay. So good afternoon in the UAE, good morning from the UK. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And if you have any further questions at all, just contact us and we will get back to you as soon as we can. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Vicky. That was a really great session.
Thank you. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.